You think you know how an execution works. A date is set. A room is prepared. A needle goes in. A sentence is carried out. Clean, final, resolved. That's the version on paper. But paper doesn't account for a man writhing on a gurney for 43 minutes, while officials scramble and whisper behind a curtain. Paper doesn't account for a woman with the mind of a child being put to death, while the men who actually pulled the trigger walk the prison yard every morning, alive. Paper doesn't account for a body that refuses to die, gasping, gulping, convulsing for nearly 2 hours, while witnesses watch in horror and attorneys beg courts for an emergency stay that never comes. The death penalty in America is supposed to be clinical, controlled, humane. But 10 times it became something else entirely. These are not stories about whether capital punishment is right or wrong. This is about what actually happened in the execution chamber, in the final minutes, in the moments nobody planned for. What happened when the state pressed forward and the body, the law, or the conscience of a nation pushed back? 5 cases today, 5 more in part 2. Every single one will stay with you. Let's begin. Teresa Lewis. She wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. That matters. Remember that. It's October 2nd, 2010, in Jarrett, Virginia. Teresa Lewis, age 41, is strapped to a gurney inside the Greensville Correctional Center. In a few minutes, she will become the first woman executed in the state of Virginia in nearly 100 years. Her crime was cold and calculated in the most tragic way imaginable. In 2002, Teresa conspired with 2 men, Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, to murder her husband, Julian Lewis, and his son, Charles Lewis, for a combined insurance payout of over $250,000. She let the men into the house in the middle of the night. She unlocked the door. Schallenberger and Fuller did the killing. Both men were shot in their sleep. Teresa was arrested within days. She confessed. What followed was one of the most debated executions in modern American history, not because of what happened in the chamber, but because of who was in it. Teresa Lewis had an IQ of 72, clinically borderline intellectual disability. Her own attorneys argued she was the least culpable person in the conspiracy. Schallenberger, who investigators believe actually masterminded the plot, later wrote letters from prison admitting he manipulated Teresa. He described her as easily controlled, emotionally vulnerable, desperate for love. He died in prison, of suicide, years before she was ever executed. Both triggermen received life sentences. Teresa got death. Governor Bob McDonnell reviewed her case and declined clemency. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. Even former President Jimmy Carter and Desmond Tutu called for her sentence to be commuted. None of it changed anything. On the gurney, Teresa Lewis is calm. Her last words are brief. She looks at Julian's daughter, a woman who supported the execution, and says, "I want Kathy to know I love her, and I'm sorry." Then she turns to her own family, tells them she loves them. The sedative enters the line. Within minutes, Teresa Lewis is dead. The execution itself was unremarkable. What was remarkable was everything that led to it. The question no one could fully answer. Did Virginia just execute a manipulated woman while the man who used her is already in the ground? That question has no clean ending. Ronnie Lee Gardner. Ronnie Lee Gardner didn't want the needle. He wanted something older, something he felt was honest. June 18, 2010, Utah State Prison, Draper. Shortly after midnight, Gardner is taken to a specially constructed room. A metal chair sits against a sandbag wall. 5 shooters are waiting, each with a .30 caliber rifle. One of the 5 carries a blank. No one will know who fired the kill shot. That is the design. Gardner chose the firing squad. Utah law gave him the option, and he took it without hesitation. His crime was brutal and specific. In 1985, Gardner murdered Michael Burdell, an attorney, during a dramatic and bloody courthouse escape attempt in Salt Lake City. It wasn't his first killing. He had murdered a bartender named Melvin Otterstrom years before, stabbing him to death during a robbery. Ronnie Lee Gardner was, by any measure, a violent man with a violent history. But this execution wasn't just a legal event. It was a cultural flashpoint. By 2010, the firing squad had become an almost mythological relic of American punishment, something from westerns, from the frontier. Most states had moved on. Gardner's choice ripped the conversation wide open again. Was it barbaric? Was it, as some argued, actually more humane than a lethal injection gone wrong? Gardner didn't frame it in humanitarian terms. He just said he preferred it. In his final hours, he watched the Lord of the Rings trilogy, all 3 films. He requested a last meal of lobster tail, steak, apple pie, and vanilla ice cream. At 12:17 a.m., Gardner is seated in the chair. A white target, a small circle, is pinned over his heart. He wears a hood over his head. His attorney reports that in their last conversation, Gardner was composed, resigned. The order is given. 5 shots fire simultaneously. Ronnie Lee Gardner is dead within seconds. The medical examiner confirms it was immediate. There was no chaos, no malfunction, no drawn-out suffering. Just 5 rifles, 1 target, and a man who knew exactly what he was choosing. Utah would authorize the firing squad again in subsequent years. Gardner's execution remains one of the last of its kind in the modern United States, and for many people, a reminder that the debate over how we kill is just as fraught as the debate over whether we should. Clayton Lockett. On April 29, 2014, Clayton Lockett was supposed to die quietly. He did not. Lockett's crime is almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. In 1999, he and 2 accomplices kidnapped 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman after a robbery gone wrong. They drove to a dirt road outside of Waleetka, Oklahoma. They shot her twice. And then, while she was still alive, they buried her. She begged. She screamed. She told them she didn't want to die. They kept shoveling. Lockett was convicted and sentenced to death. For 15 years, the legal process ground forward. Then came the night of April 29th. Oklahoma had recently switched to a new 3-drug execution protocol using midazolam as a sedative, a drug that had never been used in a U.S. execution before. The vein they chose to insert the IV collapsed. The execution begins at 6:23 p.m. At 6:33, Lockett is declared unconscious. The 2nd and 3rd drugs are administered, and then something goes wrong. At 6:36, Lockett begins moving. He is not supposed to be moving. He raises his head. He tries to lift his body off the gurney against the restraints. He is gritting his teeth. He is groaning. The blinds to the observation room are closed. Witnesses are shut out. Officials huddle. They attempt to stop the execution. They cannot. The IV line has failed. The drugs have pooled in tissue instead of entering the bloodstream. Clayton Lockett does not die.
He writhes on that gurney for 43 minutes. 43 minutes of movement, of sound, of something that witnesses who heard it through the curtain would later describe as a nightmare. He finally dies at 7:06 p.m., not from the execution drugs, but from a heart attack. Oklahoma's Department of Corrections director calls it a failure of the protocol. A formal review is launched. Executions in the state are temporarily halted. The family of Stephanie Neiman is divided. Some say it was justice. Others just want it to be over. But what happened in that chamber cannot be undone by a report. Witnesses heard a man dying badly. And the question, the one that echoed through courtrooms and newsrooms for years after, is whether that was a malfunction to be fixed or a warning that could not be ignored.
Joseph Wood. If Clayton Lockett's execution lasted too long, Joseph Wood's execution made Lockett's look brief. July 23, 2014. Arizona State Prison Complex, Florence. Joseph Wood is scheduled to die by lethal injection for the 1989 murders of Deborah Dietz and her father, Eugene Dietz. His estranged girlfriend and her father, both shot at point-blank range at the family auto repair shop. Deborah had tried to end the relationship. Wood killed them both in front of witnesses. His execution begins at 1:52 p.m. Witnesses report that within minutes something is clearly wrong. Wood is still breathing. Not slowly fading, actively breathing, gasping, gulping. The sound, witnesses say, is like a man snoring heavily over and over again. The rhythm doesn't stop. It doesn't slow. It continues. Wood's attorneys are in the observation room. At 2 p.m., 8 minutes into the execution, they file an emergency appeal. They argue their client is being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment in real time. The appeal travels up the court ladder at extraordinary speed. Courts review it. Courts deny it. Meanwhile, Joseph Wood is still breathing. His attorneys file with the U.S. Supreme Court at 2:45 p.m. It is denied within minutes. Wood is still breathing. Over the course of 1 hour and 57 minutes, 1 hour and 57 minutes, Joseph Wood gasps for air more than 600 times. 640 times, according to witnesses who counted. The drugs used were hydromorphone and midazolam, the same class of sedative that failed in the Lockett case 3 months earlier, in a different state, with a different man, and the same catastrophic result. Wood is pronounced dead at 3:49 p.m. Deborah Dietz's sister, who witnessed the execution, does not express sympathy. She says Wood looked like he was just sleeping. Other witnesses violently disagree with that description. The divergence itself tells you everything. What one person calls peaceful, another calls prolonged torture. The drugs were the same. The room was the same. But what people saw, what they chose to see or needed to see, was completely different. In 2 executions, in 2 states, in the same summer, America watched its most clinical form of punishment become something deeply uncertain. Arizona suspended executions pending review. The review changed little. The questions remain. Lisa Montgomery. There are crimes that strain the capacity for human comprehension. And then there is what Lisa Montgomery did on December 16, 2004. Bobby Jo Stinnett was 23 years old and 8 months pregnant. She lived in Skidmore, Missouri with her husband. She bred rat terriers and connected with other dog enthusiasts online. That's how Lisa Montgomery found her. Montgomery, who had told friends and her husband that she was pregnant, drove to Stinnett's home under the pretense of buying a puppy. Once inside, she strangled Bobby Joe with a rope. Then she cut open her abdomen with a kitchen knife and removed the baby, a girl, Victoria Joe, who survived. Montgomery took the baby, drove back to Kansas, and introduced the child to her husband as her own newborn. She was arrested within 24 hours. The FBI followed a digital trail directly to her door. Victoria Joe was recovered unharmed. What Montgomery did had no legal ambiguity. What came next did. Her defense built a case not around innocence, but around the woman herself, who she had been, what had been done to her. Testimony described a childhood of catastrophic sexual abuse beginning before age 10, perpetrated by her stepfather with her mother's knowledge. She was trafficked by her own family. She suffered documented dissociative disorders, severe PTSD, and what experts called complex trauma-induced psychosis. Her attorneys argued that Lisa Montgomery, the adult who committed that crime, was the product of decades of documented atrocity inflicted on a child. The courts were not moved. The Trump administration, in its final weeks, scheduled Montgomery's execution for January 12, 2021. Legal challenges cascaded. Execution dates were postponed twice due to COVID-19 infections among her legal team. Courts debated whether it was proper to execute her while she couldn't consult with her attorneys. They went forward anyway. On January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery becomes the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. Her final words, "I am not afraid." The execution itself takes minutes. No malfunction, no groaning, just the drugs, the clock, and a room full of witnesses. What splits people in that chamber isn't the procedure, it's the silence afterward, when the question fills the air that no protocol can answer. Was justice done, or did the state just execute a woman who was herself a victim of monstrous abuse for acts she committed in the wreckage of a destroyed mind? There is no answer that satisfies everyone. There never will be. 5 cases, 5 chambers, 5 moments where the machinery of capital punishment met something it wasn't built to handle, whether that was doubt, dysfunction, or the deep discomfort of watching a human being die badly, or die controversially, or die in a way that raises more questions than it closes. But we're not done. Part 2 goes further. There's a man whose execution was stopped mid-needle and then restarted. There's a case where the wrong man may have been in the chair, and the evidence that surfaced afterward was devastating. There's a lethal injection so badly administered that witnesses filed formal complaints before the body was even cold. The script in every one of these cases went off the rails. Part 2 drops next. And trust us, it gets worse before it gets better.